Hello, all, and welcome back. I'm going to today tackle a topic that's been on my mind for a while now, and that is whether James Gunn is killing DC movies. Before I continue, I just want to note that I do have a biases towards the DC EU, Snyder movies, and most things with the Henry Cavill Superman, Ben Affleck Batman, and Gal Gadot Wonder Woman. In particular, the Zack Snyder work as, to me, he brings comic books to life in visually amazing ways, with large, epic, well-told stories. And if you are a big fan of James Gunn's stuff, more power to you, as he does make very entertaining, good to great movies overall, in my opinion. Let me take you back to the beginning of when James Gunn became co-head of DC Studios. Black Adam had just released and was a box office disappointment, and honestly, a pretty average superhero movie that didn't make too much of an impact. I enjoyed it, and the silver lining was the long overdue, awaited return of Superman on film, played by Henry Cavill. The last time I saw the vast majority of DC movie fans united and happy, and it was a big deal. Gunn was promoted to DCU co-chair, and the decision was made to scrap the ongoing DCEU. Essentially, fire Henry Cavill, Gal Gadot, and others, and start fresh. A bold strategy, one I didn't like at the time because of personal basis, as I would have just done a soft reboot, keeping the majority of the cast so that way you don't alienate fans. However, if Gunn had a bold strategy to start the DC universe from fresh and to be better than what came before in the DCEU, then I would have been game. This is where the red flags started. First off, when he took over, and between Cavill announcing his return and before he got the boot, Gunn responded to a content creator who made a claim Gunn doesn't like Cavill, which Gunn denied, and even went as far as childishly insulting the content creator. Professional behavior of a co-CEO, right? Then, Cavill is canned. So this adds legitimacy, in my opinion, to Den of Nerds who made the claim. Then we find out the Peacemaker cast, aka his friends and wife, are coming along from the DCEU. Something that doesn't sit well with me as it's clear nepotism. We lost Henry Cavill's Superman, but we keeping Diebeard. Gunn has had a checkered past on social media with some grotesque statements, which he has apologized for, which is fair, and people do change and grow up. But when he's still insulting people like a teenager, then it makes you question if he has grown and changed. See this Grace Randolph tweet as a receipt. Next, we have the big DCU slate reveal, aka the presentation to make Warner Brothers more enticing to potentially buyers. The slate, in my opinion, and many fans, was a mixed bag. Superman as your first movie made sense. A Batman Brave and the Bold movie made sense. Supergirl spinning out of Superman made a bit of sense. However, the comic it's based on was the wrong choice, as it's not a good story, just a true grit ripoff. Lanterns made sense, but more as a movie than a gritty TV show. Then the other choices were bizarre and felt more like projects James Gunn wanted to make, and ones you wouldn't make this early into your grand cinematic universe. I'm talking about Creature Commandos, The Authority, Booster Gold, and Swamp Thing. These are C-listers at best. And who wants an Amazon's prequel? Just make a Wonder Woman movie and not some Paradise Lost show. What's worse is a lot of these projects are either shelved, like The Authority, or in development hell, like Swamp Thing and Booster Gold. Now, onto the 4 remaining DCEU movies under Gunn's watch, 2 of which I am convinced he sabotaged. Shazam! Fury of the Gods came at first and was an average movie, but had this weird cringe after-credits scene of Shazam meeting with James Gunn's wife, aka Harcourt, and Diebeard, aka James Gunn's friend, and I think it speaks for itself. Not a big deal, but didn't think there was any need for it. Then the Flash movie came, and I think it was sabotaged in some ways. Shaky CGI aside, I think the movie has a very strong plot and cast. However, 2 big things hold it back. One is its over-reliance on cringe, crude humor, a James Gunn trait which I think should have been cut out. And the second was the ending. We had a perfectly emotional moment and lesson for Barry, where he must let his mother go, but is able to clear his father of her murder, which I thought was perfect. Then, from what I understand, Barry would reunite with Henry Cavill's Superman, Supergirl, a Bruce Wayne, and maybe others, which would have been a nice send-off for the DCEU. Instead, we just have this weird, awkward, nonsensical scene where George Clooney's Bruce Wayne turns up that I'm convinced was a Gunn idea. Then Blue Beetle came and went, and finally Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, the final DCEU movie, happened. It's a good fun movie, not as strong as the first. However, we had Michael Keaton Batman film scenes for it, then to be replaced by Batfleck. Now, I'm not saying the movie would have made $1 billion like the first, but would have made more money, I'd bet. Now let's jump to the beginning of the DCU to see how it's holding up so far. Creature Commandos the animated series, which came and went without much fanfare or viewership, it wasn't bad to me, it just about decent animated and scored well and overall entertaining, but it's a bit of a depressing watch at times, and the fact we get the first glimpse of Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and other DCU heroes all dead in animated form. Like, what the hell? And I wasn't a fan of the ending either, and not fussed about what happens next, as we apparently are getting a series 2. Then Superman, the true start to the DCU, and for me, James Gunn's true test whether the reboot was justified. And I did enjoy Superman and found it to be a blast and a fun time like every other James Gunn movie. However, it's just a very average superhero movie. In fact, barely a good superhero movie and a step down. Firstly, David Cornsweet as Superman, Rachel Brosnahan as Lois Lane, Nicholas Hoult as Lex Luthor, and the rest of the cast are all mostly excellent. However, the film was let down by some weak writing, in particular the writing of Superman and the fact he is a weak man-child, especially in the first half of the movie. No fault of the actor, but this Superman didn't have the presence or gravitas of previous iterations like Christopher Reeve or Henry Cavill, who I would buy leading the Justice League. This Superman, who is on his 3rd year, I do not. Even in the behind the scenes, the actor protested to James Gunn, who, due to hubris, didn't listen. So, the Superman reboot in nearly every metric is a step down from the DCEU, and even made less money than the Man of Steel movie, not even considering inflation. That said, it did receive a better critical reception as well, being the highest-grossing superhero movie of 2025. However, I don't think this movie is going to age well, as it doesn't have the timeless feel to me that Superman 1978 and Man of Steel have. Could the movie be considered a win? I'd say no. As it was revealed under oath in the U.S. Senate, the movie was pulled from theaters due to not meeting expectations, and I don't think it had the momentum needed to carry over with future projects, which I'll soon be bringing up. So to capitalize on Superman's success, it was heavily pushed that Peacemaker Series 2 was the follow-up and required viewing for the DCU. Two big problems with this. One, Superman is a family-friendly, feel-good blockbuster, and Peacemaker Series 2 is very crude, adult, and not really a good follow-up at all to Superman. The other is, it wasn't good, as despite claims it's James Gunn's favorite and best work, apparently it's a step down from the first series, which was a good fun side series in the DCEU. It introduced the multiverse, which I liked. However, instead of using it to explain why Peacemaker is in the DCU, not DCEU, which would have been interesting, they just did a lazy recap retcon at the start. The series itself is consistently good throughout, introducing Earth X, aka the DC Nazi Earth. However, once we get towards the end, this is a totally wasted concept, and the finale was just crap. Literally was a slog of episode that had, I think, 2 long music numbers, with James Gunn himself cameoing for some reason. And it didn't really properly wrap up the Earth X plot. And also it barely charted on streaming also, similar to Creature Commandos, which is not a good sign. Compare that to the ratings of the non-DCU James Gunn Penguin series on the same streaming service, and it's night and day, and reflects on the DCU lack of momentum. Now on to the recent Supergirl movie. And yikes, where to start? My thoughts on the movie. Below average with a fine but repetitive plot propped up by the interesting Kryptonian flashbacks and Superman and Lobo appearing. Supergirl herself was good and played well, but the villain was so bland and everything else about it was just fine. But the critical, fan, and box office reception has been savage, making it one of the biggest superhero bombs of recent memory. Not good. Then the upcoming slate looks pretty bad. Lanterns, a Green Lantern series with little cosmic elements, Clayface, a body horror movie that no one asked for that has no place in a DC universe without a Batman, then a recently announced Jimmy Olsen Gorilla Grodd comedic crime series. Like, what the hell are we doing? Only thing that I have any excitement for is Man of Tomorrow, because it's Superman and Lex Luthor battling Brainiac, and a sequel to the one good project being Superman. To summarize, why do I think James Gunn is killed DC movies? The brand was already in a bad way at the tail end of the DCEU, with the only true recent successes being Zack Snyder's Justice League, in my opinion, as that generated a lot of hype and eyes on the universe. And since James Gunn did his half-assed reboot, things are only getting worse, with a weaker, less popular version of Superman and mostly side characters everywhere with James Gunn's fingerprints all over it. And that big slate reveal we had a few years back is not even close to coming true, with stalled and canceled projects. The DCU feels small and half-baked, and in the age of superhero fatigue, this damages the brand further. Gunn himself is killing it with advertising for Superman, and everything else being heavily focused on him and not the true stars of the show being the heroes themselves. His narcissism and this annoying cringe narrative that he understands the comics with his frequent pandering is getting old and disproven. Like Superman completely changed Superman's origin, making his father Jor-El send him to Earth to conquer it, something I actually liked but far from the comics. Then Supergirl doesn't even attempt the message of the one comic it's based on. Gunn's talent lies in taking obscure characters to the mainstream and not epic storytelling with A-list heroes, something the Russo brothers and Zack Snyder excel at. When, not if, James Gunn is fired, and the DC universe needs to reboot again, he would have left it in a worse shape than he apparently was going to quote-unquote save it. As you can't do a third reboot, audiences won't care less than they already do. I hope I'm wrong, but I think he's been a disaster that not only tanked what remained of the DCEU, but then went on to create a worse universe in the DCU for the sake of his own ego and a paycheck for his friends and family. And he has destroyed any hope for an epic, consistent DC shared movie universe going forward. And this is without mentioning the other things he's said and done in his past. Thanks for tuning in. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Follow me on Twitter. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And as always, this is the Easy Nerd, signing off.